Cool. Thanks, man. Hmm. All right. I think so. Okay. Cool. Um, I'm Murat, like that, Murat, but it turns into Murat, which is fine. It's a Turkish name. So, I was with Lighthouse for its first 2 years, I think it was. So I met Karim and Jeremy and stuff when they first came to Vancouver. Um, and I got introduced to them as like just someone that they should meet in the startup scene because they wanted to meet some devs or whatever, and we went out for beers. And they were talking about how they were gonna start looking for teachers, and I was drunkenly like, "I'll give it a shot." And then our first class was like 5 people or something, and then grew quite a bit. But obviously, I was also consulting at the same time, and then one of my projects started taking off, so I kind of stopped teaching. Um, I think that must have been like 3 years ago, actually. But I miss it. I miss it a lot. So occasionally, I come in to do some guest lectures or whatever, and I'm thinking I might do some more. Um, and if you guys are curious, the product that I'm working on now, it's called CEO.ca. It's like a chat community for stock market people. It came out of like a side project. Um, the previous version was like anonymous registration with chat that I was doing just for fun. We actually used to use it like in the classes. Um, so I didn't know who the people were. You just pick any name and post, and the students would make fun of like how many times I was playing with my beard and stuff. It's pretty fun. And then just through luck, meeting someone who was looking for developers, they came to Lighthouse looking for people, connected me with him, and we became partners. And so that's what I've been doing for quite a while now. But I've been hermiting so much working from home that I just really want to get back out and see you guys, and also meet all the people that like come and go through Lighthouse. It's a great way to find clients and all those things. So that's me. Um, in terms of the format of the lecture, please interrupt me anytime. Like, there's no such thing as a dumb question. You guys are supposed to not understand a whole bunch of things, and like, uh, for the first couple of years of my programming career, I got so much stuff done without understanding why or how it worked. Like, it's kind of hard to believe it worked at all. And you guys are probably going to go through the same things where like, oh, it works because it does. I don't know why. And then uh, what I want to encourage is like try to have a deterministic understanding such that you can just like run the simulations in your head eventually. And then there's no more question because like every single character means something. Nothing is there just for looking pretty or whatever. So I think it's really important to stop and ask why exactly something is going on. So just gonna start from reviewing some of yesterday's stuff. Do you guys have any questions first of all from the content, yesterday's content? Anything comes to mind? Anything that was particularly difficult? All good? Did anyone like try the stretch stuff, the battleship or whatever? Yeah. Yeah, I saw that. I was like, that's pretty crazy. Someone can get that done. um, and okay, let's just do a quick example here. So I'm just gonna make an object called person, and it's gonna have fields like name. Um, so let's say this is like a user object that you would use on a website or something, and then it'll have something like an array called permissions, and in there we're gonna have objects that are like gonna define which parts of the website someone might have access to. So we'll say things like type is read, level is 1, and then copy that. I'm using Vim, by the way, so it might look like things are happening magically sometimes. Um, just as a quick test, if I want to make a function that checks to see if this user has permissions for level 3. So let's make a function actually. I'll make this bigger. Okay, now I'm going to start asking some questions. So if I want to have a function called check permission, and I want to see, I want to essentially see if a particular user has a particular level of permission. What are the arguments for this function going to be? I guess there's like many different ways to get this working. I mean, that could work. So if the first argument wasn't the name, then we would go and search through a bunch of person objects or something and find the one that has the matching name, I guess. Is that sort of where you're going? Right. In this case, I'm thinking more like, let's assume we have a bunch of objects and we'll pass the whole person object in, perhaps. Yeah. So that would probably be the second argument, because we're going to check permission for a particular permission level. So maybe I'll say level for the second argument. And for the first one, just for this example's sake, I'll call this person. I'll call it something slightly different from the variable name I used above, just to indicate that it doesn't have to be the same. You're going to say something? Or either of you? Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. So for this case, I just decided maybe we'll just go with level, where you have to have equal or greater in one of your permissions or something like that. What is this function going to return most likely? Yeah, true or false makes sense. Because something like check permission, you either have it or you don't. So I'll just put return result or something at the end, just as a placeholder for now. So if I wanted to access, I'm just going to open a parentheses here. This is not continuing the function, but just a syntax related sanity check to make sure everyone's on board. If I want to access this type right, so the value that I want to get is right, how can I dial in to this object so to get that value? So I'm going to go person and then dot or square bracket or bunch of stuff, and I'm eventually going to access that key, and then it'll return me that value. What characters do I need to type here? Does the question make sense? Okay, so dot permissions is good, and then you said square bracket type like this. Think about what is going to be returned from permissions. So the key is permissions. So we are here. So when you access that particular key, it's going to return whatever value is sitting on that key, right? So what? Yeah. Yes. So exactly. So this little square bracket here is hinting to us that the value is actually an array. So that's going to return the array. Which means if we want to read one of the elements in the array, we have to access it by index. So it's this one that I want. So what syntax do I write to get there? Here. Yeah. Yeah. So now that will return us this object, the second element. And now what? I want to get the value right. Dot type. Yeah. Exactly. And does this have any difference from the second line? Yeah, it's exactly the same. Just two different syntax for doing the same thing. The way I like to think about it is like when you have an array, the index is always an integer, starting from 0. And then when you have an object, the index can be anything. It can still be a number. Like you could still have an object where like you manually make your index like keys like 0 and 1 and stuff. And it would still work. But the idea is that you're not constrained. Yeah. I think it's any primitive. Although, let's try it out. This is one of those crazy things that like you don't try until someone asks you. So if I was to make an object, and then I make a second object where the key is the first object. Oh, wait, what am I doing? Yeah. Yeah, it's not going to work like that. So, so object 2 square bracket. There we go. Oh yeah, it just casts us to, yeah. Whenever it comes across an object that it doesn't know how to turn into a string, it just returns a string that's an object object. That makes sense. So primitives. Yeah. And then I was gonna do one more thing. Actually, no, this is fine. Any questions so far? Okay. And so if I want to check the permissions, what do I have to do? So to put it in words, I want to go through every permission and see if at least one of them matches the level that we're looking for. Right. How have you guys been iterating so far? Okay, cool. I'll just use the same then. So for var I in person obj, then what? So I'm iterating over which values? Sorry? So the person is the name of the object already, the variable. And then it has these keys. So if I want to look through the... Yeah. This should work. Doesn't it just give you the index? Which in this case is fine. I just wanted to use the least confusing syntax for now. Um, I think when you say of, is it the value that it returns? Right. Has anybody not used of here? Yeah, okay, so you guys haven't used. Okay, I just won't do that. And if I want to get the permission object now, which are these guys, what would I do here? Let me know if I'm going too slow or anything, but I just want to make sure. What am I trying to do in this for loop? Whoa. Sorry? Do another for loop? So if I do another for loop, which values would I go through? Like think about what we're doing in this for loop already. So since I said person object dot permissions, we're already looking at this array here. So this for loop is already going over that array. Right. Or level more specifically in this case. Right. So since this is an array, now I can access the index as we're looping through. So this is good. I'm just going to save it to a variable so it's more readable. I'm going to say var permission object is equal to this guy. So now this permission object variable represents this object for the first round of the loop, and then the second round it's going to represent this one. So now we can do like a quick check to be like if permission object dot it's greater than equal to the level that we were provided in the function to check it, then we instantly know this person has permission, right? As long as any of them pass, we're good. So what should I do here? Yeah. Return true. We can do that right away, actually. This return result thing, we didn't even end up needing it. So the moment any of them matches, I can just return the function, and that's going to stop executing right there, and we're good. How about the case where we want to return false? So let's think of what happens there. Think about what happens here. So the way we're going to call this function is going to look like this, right? Check permission, we're going to pass in person, and we're going to pass in level 2 as the second argument. So when it's looping through permissions here, on the first round, it's going to be looking at the first permission object, right? What's going to happen in this if and else? It's going to return false right away. Even though there's another permission object with the appropriate level weighting, it's going to see the first one, and it's going to return false immediately. So this else doesn't seem to work here. Does that make sense? Sorry. No, it's more than redundant. It actually makes the function not work. So I can demonstrate really quick. What file are we in right now? Object.js. Okay, so I'm gonna console log the output of this function. Node object. So it's just false, even though this person for sure has level 2 permission. Do you understand why it returned false? So if you think about it, so if we kind of like picture our for loop as a table, and we have like the iterations on each row. So the first time around, second time around. So we have the level coming from the permission object. The first time around, actually this 0, 1 doesn't make sense. I'm just going to do number 1. So this is step 1. The first permission object we're looking through has level 1, which is not enough. And the second round, it has level 2, which is enough. But the moment you look at this value, the if check fails. It goes to the else, and it says return false. And it doesn't even continue running the function anymore. So the moment you return, your execution has halted right here. So if you want to make it to the second check, you can't return. So what do we do instead? Return false without the else. So kind of like this, outside of the if check kind of thing. It's the same. It's actually the same as before, because it'll check. It'll be like, no, the first one doesn't have enough. And then it will immediately return false on the next line. So it behaves the same as the last one for this particular input. So save false into a variable kind of thing. Right, right. Which kind of brings us back to like var result or whatever. You were going to say something? Yes, that's the answer I was looking for actually. So I'm just going to go through the saving variable example and then clean it up after. So for something like the result, maybe we start by assuming that the permission doesn't check. The default state should probably be that someone doesn't have permission, and then as we check, we're like, no, okay, they do. So we can flip it later. So I can be like, now result is flip to true if the level is matching. And if not, don't do anything. Run through the whole thing, and at the very end of the function, something like this. And just to make sure it works, wait, did I save it? There we go. So now it's saying true. So now it's working for this case. And then if I was to change the level to 3, it should say false. I'm just going to do another test case. Now it's saying false. So the function is working correctly now. The key here is that returning the value is happening after the for loop is done, because that means we've successfully checked every possible value. But in this case, we're actually maybe doing more checks than necessary, because assume that we had another permission on the first item that said level 5 or something. So if this is the case, the first iteration of the for loop, it's going to come here, it's going to check that is level 5 greater than or equal to 2, which is what we're checking for. It's like, yes, this person definitely has the permission. It'll set result to true, and then it'll keep checking. It'll go to the next item that is level 1. It's not really necessary. So the moment we know that we have the correct permission, we can return true right away. And when the function is done running the for loop, if we haven't returned true, then we've looked through every value, we haven't found a match, so we can just return false at the end. So this way, the moment it finds the right level, it returns true, and if not, it keeps checking. So the only case where you look through all the values is essentially the person doesn't have permission, or they don't have the permission on the last object, kind of thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. The reason you can't is because this permissions is actually an array. So to be able to access the keys in the objects that are elements in the array, you have to target them by index first. So I don't think there's really any way of doing it without a loop, unless if you manually type again and again. Like you could be like person object dot permissions and then square bracket index, then you can check for level. Does that make sense? No, I see what you're asking. So if you did something like this, no, it's not going to give you all the levels. As convenient as that would be, yeah, I mean, it would try to look for a key called level on the permissions array, which doesn't exist. Right. Like with a like this kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. Let me just clean it up. Thanks for mentioning that. Recommended against it. Yeah. No, they're right. They're right. To relieve any confusion, this makes more sense. Any questions? Okay. Okay, now I'm going to start getting into the topic, which is callbacks a little bit, but let's forget about the word callback. Um, yeah? Oh, thanks for finding that. Yeah, it's easy to forget. Could you please repeat the... Oh, yeah, sorry. Sorry about that. Totally forgot. Okay, I will repeat the questions from now on. Okay, so now I'm just going to do some random math functions to demonstrate something in JavaScript where you can pass a function as an argument. So I'm just going to have like a basic function called multiply or something. That's going to take two numbers. Pretty boring. Sorry about that, but it is what it is. And then I'm going to have another function called subtract, perhaps, or divide. And now I'm just going to have a function called apply twice. So for apply twice, I'm also going to give a and b as numbers, and then the third argument is going to be called math functions. Where I'm trying to go with this is I want to have a function where given these numbers, I want it to apply whatever math function I'm telling it twice. Keeping it at twice for simplicity, but you could obviously do it as many times. Um, so essentially, the behavior I'm trying to get from it is something like if I was to call multiply with two numbers like 10 and 20, let's say. So the result is going to be 200, and then it's going to multiply that by 20 again. So it looks something like this. Does that sort of make sense? So we're using b, the second number, as the number that's going to multiply twice. And then for divide, it'll be the same thing. And let's just, for the sake of this example, assume that this applying functions twice is something that keeps coming up with different math functions. So every time I want to do this apply twice thing, I could either manually write it out like this, or start abstracting it into a function called apply twice that I can reuse. Has anybody done anything with JavaScript so far where you passed a function as an argument into another function? Right, did everybody do sort? During the lecture, okay. Right, right. I'm just gonna open up a interactive node thing here. So let's just define a function called multiply. Again, a, b, return a times b. So what value do I get when I just hit enter? Is it going to call the function? What exactly is it going to do? Without brackets. Undefined is a good guess. Show the function body. The browser inspector does that, which I'll actually show. So the node terminal thing is a little less rich than the browser inspector. Oh, it does it? What version am I on? 8. Okay, that's good. I'll use the same one as you guys. Now I'm just going to do the same thing here. I'm going to function multiply a, b, return a times b. Multiply. So when I type multiply and hit enter, it's showing me the source, the actual definition of the function. So that's hinting that the keyword multiply, it's just like a variable. It's the same thing as a variable, except it doesn't hold a value. It holds a function definition. And as long as I use these variables that refer to that function definition, they can be passed around. So what's going to happen if I say something like var nonsense name, nonsense variable equals multiply? So what's going to happen if I see the return value of this nonsense variable now? The same thing. So the function has been defined. The function doesn't even need or have a name necessarily. It's just a definition of a bunch of code sitting in memory, and then you use variable names to refer to that function definition. So we have two names for the same function, essentially. They're not two separate functions. Does that make sense? Like if you think about just like where they are sitting on the computer's memory, there's only one function definition and two names that point at it. So coming back to the example of apply twice, because of that, because of the fact that I can refer to functions by name and pass them around, I can have a function argument that's expecting a function definition to be passed in instead of values. By the way, just going back to this example, any idea what's going to happen if I do this? Nothing. Did you just try it or did you just know that? Yeah, exactly. So what did it try to do there? Let's just walk through what exactly happened there. Yeah, exactly. It tried to multiply two values that don't exist. So basically, if the function definition, which was up here, expects two values, and the function was called with less than two values, it's just going to fill in the missing values as undefined. So A had the value undefined, B had the value undefined, and then trying to multiply two undefineds together gave not a number. Any guess what's going to happen if I say 3, 5, 10? Guessing error. Just multiplied 3 and 5 and ignored the third one. JavaScript is a pretty loose language. It lets you make mistakes and then kind of corrects it to the best of its guessing abilities. Yes. JavaScript arguments array. There's an arguments object that I think it's just like one of those built-in keywords where whenever you say arguments, it'll just return an array of all of the arguments passed into the current function you're in. So you can use that to create functions that can take any number of arguments. Like you could have like one called multiply, where no matter how many you give it, multiplies all of them, kind of thing. Okay, yeah, yes, exactly. I actually don't mind googling things on lectures because it kind of just like shows the keywords that I choose and how I skim through and click and stuff. So I really don't mind doing it. Just gonna check the Calgary side for a second. All good? Okay. There's probably a way to do it. I didn't set up notifications yet. Okay, so back to this multiply and divide example. So instead of manually typing multiply twice, I want to make use of my apply twice function. We haven't filled in the contents of how apply twice works yet, but the way I want to be able to call it is say apply twice, give it the A and B numbers, and the third one I want to say multiply. So since we define multiply up here, the variable name multiply is pointing to that function definition. So when I use the word multiply as an argument here, it's literally going to pass that function's definition as the third argument. Does that make sense, or is that confusing to anyone? And then I might, on the next line, pass different numbers and a different function. This reads a little bit nicer than something like this. It hints better at my intentions. even though it's going to do the same thing. Okay, so now that we've defined how we want to call these functions, let's fill in the contents of apply twice. Any guesses of how this apply twice function is going to be defined? Just yell out, it's okay. Sorry? Like this? Uh-huh. On the right track so far. So that's applying the math function once. What else do I add? Like that? Sorry, how did you mean? Okay. B again, like this, yeah. Just an alternative way to write the same thing as above. We might do something like first equals math function A and B. And then maybe the second run is going to be now first, comma B. Exact same behavior as what's happening up here. Are you guys used to doing things like just mentally replacing the return values of things? And like when you pass an argument that's also a function call, is there anyone confused about what goes on there? Are there any questions about this? Like the way I like to think about it is like, you know, when you do normal math by hand, and you might say something like 3 plus 5 times 2 divided by 4 plus 3. So you know how like the meanings of these change as you put brackets around different parts of it? And then when you're calculating the value here, you mentally look through the innermost bracket pairs. You mentally replace it with what they're supposed to be. And then change the 4 plus 3 to 7, let's say. And then you can figure out the final number. So there's like this step-by-step mental thing we do, starting from innermost and going to the outermost. It's the same thing with calculating functions. So when I see two function calls where one of them is happening inside the other one as the argument, I look at the innermost one, imagine what the return value for that is going to be, and just like mentally put that value in here. So in this case, I would mentally replace it with A times B as the first argument. Oh, thank you. So I'm just going to stick with the first one here. And if I console log these results, what's going to happen now? What values am I going to see when I run math.js? So it's going to log the outputs of these two functions. In 5 minutes. Nothing to return? Yes. Can everybody see why that is? Or not? What are we missing here? Right, exactly. I didn't return anything from the function. So we have to say return here. If you don't say return, by default, it's just going to return undefined. Oh, are we not in the right file? What file am I in? Functions.js. Whoopsies. There we go. Now we're getting the numbers. Feel free to ask any questions or expand on anything. Otherwise, just going to take a break for a little bit. Yeah, if anybody wants to keep thinking about it, think about how we could change it so that instead of apply twice, we say something like apply n times, and then we provide another variable, and then maybe it'll keep applying it 10 or 20 or whatever number of times. Okay, I'm going to go into the break mode. Is it everyone here? I think so, right? One more? Oh, there he is. Could it be because I'm not talking, or is it definitely not working? It looks like it's working here. Still not working, Kate? Okay, cool. Sweet. Oh, yeah, maybe that's why. Yay. Any questions so far about this passing function in as an argument business? Um, you guys will probably hear the term anonymous functions a lot. Uh, which could be confusing, but it literally just means a function that doesn't have a name. So you know, in this in these two examples, the functions have a name because they're assigned to a variable essentially called multiply and divide. So those are their names. But I don't even have to define it separately before passing it in. So here's something you'll see a lot in JavaScript. You'll see the function defined right in the arguments. And then the function will have arguments A and B since so if you think about the contents of our apply twice function, you know how like math function is being passed in as the third argument, and then we call it with A and B? Because of the fact that we're calling this function with A and B, it's implicit that we expect it to have two arguments. So whatever math function is, whatever function definition gets passed as the third argument, we expect it to have two arguments, right? Like as I was showing the examples before, where like you call a function with less or more arguments than it was defined for, like it'll still try to do something. But the idea is that when I'm calling this function that got passed in, whatever function got passed in, this stuff is only going to work properly if they expect to have two arguments. So similarly, when I do an anonymous function where it's not named, I'm just defining the function on the spot and passing it in. I'll have to make sure that it's being defined with two arguments. And in here, maybe we'll do something else like return A plus B instead now. So in this case, I never named this function sum or something. But it's still going to work just the same. Wait, I gotta save the file first. And if you look at the syntax, you just have to be careful where you still have to close your curly bracket. And then after you close your curly bracket, you close the regular bracket, which define the function arguments. Does this make sense? Okay. So I've basically been showing one random use case where it doesn't really allow us to do anything new. Like just because we're passing functions around, as I was showing before, we could have easily done it by manually typing it by hand. The behavior isn't anything new. This so far has only helped to like kind of clean up the code. But what I'm slowly building up to is passing functions around starts allowing you to do things in JavaScript that you can't necessarily do in other languages. It's sort of what differentiates JavaScript the most, if you ask me. So just keep in mind that that's what we're slowly building up to. And before we get there, I just want to do one more example before wrapping up, which is instead of something like apply twice, I've actually decided we're going to apply random function. So in this case, we're going to have our a and b numbers again. And then the third argument, I want it to be an array of functions. And I want apply random function to look at the array of functions, pick one randomly, and apply it to the two numbers, and return that number. So the way we're going to call this function, it's going to look like apply random function 10, 20, and then the third argument, what is it going to look like now? So I'm hinting at it, but with its name. And I would like it if you guys told me what the type. Yeah. Yeah, totally. So we can put multiply, divide, and we can do the same thing. We can type it straight into here. And then close the array bracket, close the function bracket. Does that make sense? Is it getting crazy? Okay, I'm gonna omit the last one for now, just to keep it simple. So now I have an array of two functions. It's totally doable. There's nothing wrong with throwing functions into all sorts of different data structures. In fact, you know when you guys were doing the you guys did the this keyword thing a little bit? Did you guys do it yesterday? Where like you have an object and you have a key and the value is a function. You can do that. Functions are just like other objects; they can be passed around. And now let's just fill this in. Obviously, we're going to need a way of picking a random element from an array. What do we do when we have something like this in mind? We type it in to Google. I still do. After what is it? Probably been like a paid programmer for 12 years. I still go to Google and type random array JavaScript. Because I don't want to think about this stuff. I want to think about my product. Just going to copy and paste this. I just have to change my array to functions array, I guess. There we go. And you know, if you guys are curious, all it's doing is picking a random number, which returns something between 0 and 1. Multiplying it by the number of elements that we have. So if you have 10 elements and the random number returns 0.4, that's going to return 4 point something. And then it does math.floor to turn it into an integer. And then that becomes the index. And yeah, I'll post these on Gist and stuff. So if you guys want to look through it later, you can. But I'm going to skip that because the point here is not the random element thing. The point is being able to apply a random function to these two numbers. So now I'm just going to say return random function a and b. Makes sense? Let's try it. Unexpected token. Oh, of course. We're defining a function. So 200, 0.5, 0.5. 200. So it's randomly picking either divide or multiply because those are the two functions we provided in this array. If I wanted to see which function is being printed, just a console log, where would I put that? So I just want to print out which function is being called. Just so that it's not guesswork from the number itself. Just as an exercise to like debug, just to make sure like everything is working correctly, kind of thing. Where should I put my console log statement? Within the apply random function. So what should we try? Okay, let's give it a shot. Yeah, function multiply. Because it had a name. It's not an anonymous function. It had a name, so it can say function multiply. Now, let's see what happens when we pass in an anonymous function. Okay, thank you for that. Can you use the apply twice function with the apply random function as an input? Yes, absolutely. Yep, definitely. In fact, we can add that in as well. Basically, what determines what functions you can pass as arguments is just going to be based on you mentally keeping track of whether or not they accept the same input, and they return the correct expected values, kind of thing. So as long as we have any function that takes in two inputs in this case, it would work fine. So actually, yeah, when we think of apply twice, that might not work actually in the sense that it expects 3 arguments. So we would have to change the way apply random function works for that to go smoothly. Apply twice expects 3 inputs, so we'd have to change yeah, cool. And let's just try this anonymous function business before moving on. A minus b, I'm gonna say. So yeah, in this case, because the function doesn't have a name, when we tried printing the number, when we tried console logging random function, it just said function without a name. So there you go. That's one difference between a named and anonymous function. All good so far? Okay. So I'm going to talk about something very fundamental to JavaScript now really quick. Does the word event loop mean anything to you guys? Have you at least heard the term or something? It's not the main point of this lecture, but I just want to plant the seed for you guys to like be aware of something like an event loop. So in regular programming languages, all code is executed top down, right? So like even if there's a sorry, just gonna open a file here. When I say top down, it doesn't necessarily only go top down, because at some point you define a function and the function hasn't been used yet, and later down the line you call that function, which means the execution is going to come here and then jump back up to whatever definition there is, run those lines, and then when that function is done, it's going to continue, so on and so forth, right? So in that sense, there's a bit of jumping around the file based on functions and so on and so forth, but everything is happening linearly. In any traditional programming language, what I mean is, even when the execution of this code comes to the function call and goes back up here, it's not going to continue running the rest of the file until this function has completed executing. So there's only one operation being done at a time, generally, in programming languages. So when you have something like an operating system where there are multiple programs running, there's like Spotify playing music, there's your browser downloading something, there's like a video playing in the background. Do you guys have any idea how multiple things are able to happen at the same time on a computer? Because like if you think about a CPU, it's just a little chip that's able to execute one instruction at a time. And what do you mean by handled? By the way, the answer was it's handled by the operating system kernel. And what do you mean by that? Right. 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 The answer was the operating system has a way of sorry, what did you say? Of alloc Right. It has a way of allocating time and resources to the different things that are going on. Yes, exactly. What's going on is that this, even though the CPU can only do one operation at a time, the operating system gives a little bit of CPU time to every program. It kind of just like swaps through them. It's like, oh, Spotify needs to play the song. Let's play a a microsecond of the song, and then it's like, oh, okay, browser needs to do this. Oh, there's a video playing. So it's switching between these tasks so fast that to your perception, you have the illusion of concurrency. You have the illusion of multiple things happening at the same time on your computer, which is not true. There's multiple cores, but like in the essence of it, it is still very limited. Yeah, exactly. And I'm just going to keep it simple for the sake. And the same concept carries on to any type of computer program that a user is using in real time. So if you think about a video game, once again, you have the illusion that there's an explosion going on over there, and there's a truck coming, and you're like chatting with, and there's a voice command and whatever. The game engine, this time, it's not the operating system, the game engine is allocating a little bit of time to each thing that's going on, and 60 times a second draws to the screen what it thinks you should see. And it's no different than a browser. And the browser like oriented like look on JavaScript, I think, is really important because JavaScript was invented for browsers. Only recently did it start getting used in places outside of browsers, like Node, like when you can run it in your terminal, or like for doing server-side programming. That's like relatively recent thing that people started doing. And the reason JavaScript was invented was because they needed a good way of managing all the events that are taking place on the browser to make it more interactive. So if you think about a web page, I go and click this, and something opens up, right? And sometimes you do things that might take a little bit more time. Let's say there's an animation, something just like flows into view or whatever. And when those things are happening, you don't want everything else to stop executing. So the browser and JavaScript also has a way of giving you the illusion of concurrency by doing the exact same thing, which is allocating a little bit of time to each thing that's going on. And that's sort of called the event loop. So as I'm scrolling through this page and clicking around, all these events are getting triggered that are all getting a little bit of CPU time to do what they need to do on the page. And this is where it gets a bit more complicated than just like running the code top down, where each line of code has to wait for the previous line to complete executing, kind of thing. So this is all a little bit abstract, and that's totally okay. I intend it to be confusing, but as I said, I just want to plant the seeds because this concept is going to keep coming up again and again. And it happened to me too. Like, as I was saying, for years I used things and they were working, but I wasn't clear on it. And but eventually everything clicked. So we'll get there. The most obvious example that's going to demonstrate this is set timeout. Have you guys used set timeout in any of your exercises yet? I've seen some yes and some no's. It was a yesterday? Yesterday's lecture. Okay, cool. So we're gonna go back to this now. Please let me know if I'm repeating or being boring or whatever. Isn't JS asynchronous for processing requests? Was there a sleep function in JavaScript? Probably not, right? No, it doesn't look like it. Okay. Console log program launched. Set timeout. We're going to do some stuff here. And then we're going to say program ended. So normally if we don't do something like set timeout here, and we do some random function calls, doesn't matter. Just some sort of code to execute. When I run this file, it's obviously going to go in order, right? So first it's going to say program started, and then it's going to say program ended. Makes sense. It's doing one thing at a time, and it's waiting for the previous line to finish executing before moving on to the next. Now I'm going to say set timeout, and what are the arguments for set timeout? Feel free to Google it or whatever. I'm just saying that to not make you guys fall asleep. So one of the arguments is going to be based off of milliseconds for how long it needs to wait. Which argument is that one? The second one, yeah. So we'll say we'll just wait for 1 second, 1000 milliseconds. And the first argument is what? The first argument is a function, exactly. The first argument is the function that's going to be executed in 1 second. Does it need an argument? No. Doesn't need an argument. I don't even think anything gets passed into it necessarily. It just when the timer goes off, it just calls this function. So in here, I'm going to do console log timer went off. When I run this program, what is the order in which I'm going to see the console log statements? What is this program going to print out? So, yeah, so it's first going to say program started, and then it's going to say program ended, and then it's going to say timer went off. Whoops, no timeout. Yep, that's exactly what happens. So now the idea of everything happening sequentially starts getting broken a little bit. This is because JavaScript is internally always running this event loop that checks to see if there's any time that needs to be allocated to any functions that are supposed to be running. So the loop continuously checks, is there any event that needs some attention? And if so, it gives it some attention and then continues running the code. So what happens here is it sees the first line. It's like, okay, let's console log this output. And it won't do anything until it's done doing that. So it's still like going sequentially by default. It comes to this line of code, and it's like, okay, define that anonymous function, pass it to the argument for set timeout. The timer starts running. But as far as the event loop is concerned, it's done. It starts the timer, and it doesn't have to wait for the timer to go off. So now it just has in the background a timer that's waiting. And it moves on, and it runs this other line of code, and it says program ended. But then it notices that there is a timer, there's some sort of event binding that's still waiting. So it won't quit the program. So if I comment out the set timeout thing, you'll notice that the program is gonna exit rather quickly. The moment I hit enter, I get back my console prompt because the program just quit. But if I have the timeout in here, you'll notice that it's not going to quit. It's actually going to hang, and then it's going to say timer went off. The word that you'll hear a lot is asynchronous. This is happening asynchronously. Synchronous means everything is happening in order, and every line of code is waiting for the previous line to be completed. And asynchronous means something might be happening in the background while the JavaScript engine continues running the other lines of code that come after. No, I don't think there's a way. I'm trying to think. I mean, whether or not you have an asynchronous function comes down to whether or not you are binding events or and listening to events, which I haven't seen a particular way of saying it, but it hasn't been an issue. Like you usually find out relatively easily from the documentation or just using it if something is synchronous or asynchronous. Yeah, set timeout is an example where you're not explicitly binding an event listener, but it's doing it internally for you. So an event gets triggered for when the timer goes off. So yeah, and okay. So and now I'm going to show you one more example that's perhaps less abstract. So the question was whether or not there's an easy way to tell if a function is asynchronous or synchronous. But maybe I'll try revisiting that concept later because I don't have a good answer right now. And the second example I want to show is I have this file called browser.html, inside of which I have an extremely simplistic HTML code that's just a script tag. This is actually going to execute fine on the browser. So if I just type in open browser.html, it's just going to open it in my browser, and it's going to run that JavaScript. And I had a thing that said alert hi, so just an alert box that says hi came up, just to verify that it's working. So now I want to do something where, like, perhaps I want to add a event listener for click events. So every time the user clicks anywhere on the page, I want to do something. Have you guys worked with JavaScript on the browser yet, or has it only been Node stuff? Okay. Yeah, I don't think this kind of stuff is going to be in the daily exercises or whatever, but I just want to show it, familiarize, because these functions that get passed in, which essentially is what callback means, the areas where they come up the most is situations where there's events, and it's easiest to demonstrate that on the browser. So I think you do something like documented at event listener, and I'll just look at the syntax really quick. There we go. HTML DOM add event listener. I'm just going to copy and paste this. What should happen when we click anywhere on the page? For now, I'll just console log. Load up the browser. So every time I click, it just logs clicked. Obviously, people are going to be building lots of things where like where you clicked kind of matters. So any guesses for how I might extract more information about this click event that just took place? So just to go over what's happening, JavaScript on the browser has a built-in way of attaching listeners for built-in event types. And the way you do it is you just give it the name of the event built-in event type. So click is just built in. And as the second argument, you just provide a function that you want to be called every time the event takes place. And this is, once again, something that's happening asynchronously. As the browser is running the regular JavaScript code top to down, anytime you click, boom, it's going to trigger this function in parallel to everything else that's going on. So if you were designing how this stuff works, if you wanted people to have the option to have access to details about this click event, how would you have done it? Take a guess for like what we need to add to these 3 lines of code. Just wild guesses. The question is, so like right now it's saying clicked every time I click, but let's say I want some more information about where I'm clicking. Where might this information come from? Like what might be missing here? Someone's typing. An identifier of an element on HTML. Yep, okay, that's a valid answer. It's like providing more details for what elements I attach the click event onto. But that's not where I'm trying to go with this yet. That gets a bit more complex. Yeah? Right. The answer is the callback must be passed some coordinates or something. So that usually comes from the function arguments. So this anonymous function we're defining for the click event to use when the click event takes place. And the JavaScript engine that has these event listener stuff built in is going to call my function, right? And the only way it can pass my function any additional details is through the function arguments. So even without reading any documentation, I can take a guess and say there's probably going to be some event details coming in through the function arguments. There might be multiple arguments, but I'm just going to give it a shot and try this out. I'm going to console log clicked, comma, event details. So let's try it again. Click. There we go. I got a whole object that has all sorts of information in it. It has the pixel coordinates. It has whether or not the control key is pressed, whether the shift key is pressed, the target element. So it's saying we clicked on the body element, as opposed to some other like link or something that we might have clicked. So there are built-in events such as mouse event that will provide all these information. Now, another thing that we might want to do is instead of clicked, we might want to change it to a scroll event. So every time I scroll the page, although this is going to be tricky, I need some elements in here for that to work. And then just repeat it many times so at least we can scroll. So now every time I scroll the page, it gives me the scroll event, which is, once again, have different types of details now. How late do you guys usually go with lectures? I don't want to keep you guys here too long, but if we have time, I want to do one more example. Goes to 11 usually? Okay, cool. Does everything make sense in terms of callbacks on events? Exactly. I just pick, you can pick any name because with arguments, the only place where the name of the arguments matters is within the function definition. Otherwise, the only thing that matters is the order in which they're being passed in. So whatever the first argument that the event engine passed in is, ended up being called event details in here. And just to see if there are any other arguments, I should be able to actually log the keyword called arguments, which, as we Googled in the first half, should be an array of all of the arguments that were passed. I'll do it for click. Okay, yeah, looks like arguments is just an array of one item. So that indicates that it's my callback function is being called with just the one mouse event argument. Yeah, exactly. So if there were no arguments, it might have just given you an empty array being like there are no arguments. Any questions? Okay, now we're going to go back to Node now. And I'm going to demonstrate an asynchronous callback situation with the server side. Yep. The question is about the reason for why the arguments keyword was returning an array, and whether it has something to do with like multiple events taking place. The answer is no. Arguments doesn't know anything about events taking place. It's literally just like very basic keyword that just shows just returns which arguments were passed into your current function. So it has nothing to do with asynchronous or callbacks or whatever. It's literally just, and since function arguments can be of any number from 0 to infinity, the best data structure that represents that is an array. So arguments will always return you an array, even if it's empty or there's one in there. Right. No. Yeah. The misunderstanding was the callback being passed an array, but that's not the case. It's just being passed the event object. It's just arguments that returns the array. Okay. Now, there's another question. Thank you. The question is, how does this work if I did not pass arguments to the function? That's a good question. So I think I brushed over it too quickly, but this arguments term is a special keyword in JavaScript, and it will always return all of the functions that were passed in, even if they were not in my function definition. So when I put my own argument declarations into my function definition, I'm sort of just like naming the arguments that come in when this function is called elsewhere. So what I mean by this function being called elsewhere is that somewhere in the JavaScript events engine, there's going to be a line of code that when a click event happens, it's going to take my function and call it. So if we imagine what the document add event listener function might look like, it might be something like function add event listener, and then its argument is going to be event type and callback. So it's basically going to expect the second argument to be a function definition. And then somewhere in the definition of add event listener, it's going to go callback and call that function with an event object. So in this case, maybe we'll say mouse event. And it might be something like if event type equals click, then it's going to call my function and pass it a mouse event. Now this is what we imagine there to exist in the browser source code that implements this kind of stuff. So whether or not even if I didn't have this argument listed in my function definition as I pass my callback in, it's still going to pass it in. So here, it's still going to be passed in, but it's not going to have a name. But it's still technically going to be there. So arguments is still going to return the mouse event as one of the arguments in the array. Does that make sense? So yeah, as you can see, like even my text editor is highlighting this arguments keyword yellow because it is a special reserved keyword in JavaScript, and will always return the arguments. I hope that makes sense. What is the relationship between event details and arguments? The relationship is that event details is the first argument. So arguments is going to be an array where the first element is event details. So if they were like, we can just do a tiny little side example here. So if I have a function called I don't know what to call functions that don't do anything. Okay, we'll just do multiply again. A, B, C. And we're going to return. We're first going to console log arguments, and then we're going to return A times B times C. So now when I call multiply with 10, 4, 5, oh, it returned an object. I guess it's like an array-like thing. Anyways, so basically this is what arguments was printing it out. It's showing each index 0, 1, and 2 and the values that were passed in. So it's always going to print out the arguments. Even if I pass more than the expected number, they'll still show up. Does that sort of clarify the question? Probably. Yeah. I just assumed it was an array because of how you access it by index, but oh well. Yeah, so it would be like 0 mouse event. Oh, thank you. Set timeout, console 2 and 1. Why give me 2, 1, not 1, 2? Okay, let's run that experiment. It's probably because it's taking more than 1 millisecond to process one versus the other kind of thing. How do I quit? I never know how to quit this. So let's go into timeout. So the question was, why give me 2, 1, not 1, 2? Because this one you expected to terminate first. Let's try it. On my computer, it's actually giving 1, 2, which is expected, right? Because 999 milliseconds completes first. So I think this just means my computer is faster than yours. Haha. Yeah. Yeah, it's a race condition. As I said, so to go over it one more time, the JavaScript engine is still going to parse this line by line to begin with. So it's going to see line 10 first. It's going to start that timer. And then it's going to go to the next line on line 11 and start that timer. And there's going to be a little bit of time that passes while it's doing all of those. And if that's more than 1 millisecond, then the order might swap. You get into a lot of race conditions when working with asynchronous callback situations because it's hard to be exactly sure how long things are going to take. And you really have to keep it in mind that your code might not execute in the order you thought it would. And I guarantee you this concept is going to come up in your projects. Where did event details come from? It's built into the way that the browser gave us that function called add event details. Add event listener. So all the browser is just equipped with all the event stuff where it will always pass in the event objects as the first argument to your callbacks. So we didn't build that. I hope that clarifies a little bit. Okay, we have about 5 or something minutes left, so I'm just quickly going to try to show one more server-side example. So let's call this fetch.js. Have you guys seen the JavaScript library called request? Have you guys used it so far in any of the exercises? It's going to come up later, but I just want to var request equal require request. So this is just going to be a library. We might have to npm install it. So I'll just do it really quick. npm install request. It's just a library that makes get requests to some web page and returns the results. And let's just make a request to google.com or something. I'm just going to put some placeholders there. Where result, I expect it to hold the contents of google.com. So request https google.com. Before looking at the documentation, how would you expect this library to work? Where is it going to, how is it going to give us the value that it gets from google.com? What would your first instinct be? So when we use functions that have return values, how do you collect this return value? Maybe my question isn't clear. I'm just trying to return something maybe with a callback function. That's correct. That's correct. But I want to get the wrong answer first because this is a somewhat counterintuitive. I guess what I'm trying to say is that like before when we were doing things like multiply, we were saying things like result equals multiply 10, 20 or something, right? So when a function has a return value, you kind of just like assign it to a variable or something and just use it directly. So so the first instinct usually is to do something like this, which is how it would look in many other programming languages. Because the execution of the file would halt. It would wait here until the results are fetched. And you know, it takes a second or two to make a call on the internet. So the whole program would freeze until you get the response, and it would continue running the other lines of code. And JavaScript is built in a way where you don't want the execution to be held up. You want other things to be happening in parallel, concurrently, while this request is being made to Google. In the case of the browser, it's easy to imagine why that's the case, because you don't want your browser to go unresponsive just because it's busy waiting for something. You want to be able to continue scrolling, clicking stuff and whatever, and then when it's done, it'll have like a loader animation, and then when it's done, it'll pop in, stuff like that. So you want this concurrency. So the way these types of libraries are built in JavaScript, where things take indeterminate amount of time to return, things that are not instant, they usually resort to using callbacks. So now let's look at the documentation for request. Yes, Greg's answer is correct. This program would fail because it would console log undefined. Let's just try it actually. What did I call it? Fetch. Sorry, node fetch. Actually, it didn't return undefined. It returned all sorts of crazy stuff. It returned a request object, which we'll get into later. Let's not worry about that for now. I just want to demonstrate this quickly at the end of the lecture. But like all we know is that it's not the result. It's just the request. It's just some details about how it's making the request. It hasn't actually received the results. And that's also apparent from the fact that the moment I hit enter, I instantly get the console output. There's no waiting to go and fetch the web page contents or whatever. So request.js. Simplified HTTP request client. And from the very quick documentation, you can see that you call request, and the first argument is going to be the URL as a string. And then the second argument is going to be a callback that the request library is going to call for us when it finally has the result. So it's not going to hold up execution of the rest of our program. It's going to run this function at an arbitrary point in time when it finally has the result. So going back, doing something exactly like our set timeout example, we'll say console log making request last line of code in file. And this var result equals business is not how this library is designed, so I'm just going to delete this. And we're going to put our callback function in here. The argument is going to be what? Just call it whatever I want, but what should I call it? Request brings back the result, or response for more clarity, because the HTTP world uses the terms request and response. Oh, actually, sorry, I was wrong. The first one is error, response, and then body. And let's just console log got result, and then we'll print the body. So probably quite obvious by now, but what's the order in which we're going to see the console log statements now? Oops. Now when I run it, Google.com's output is quite cryptic, but here it is. It says making a request. It says last line of code and file, and then it says got result. So, to sum up the situation, the reason callback functions are really important in JavaScript isn't just about organizing your code nicely. It's that it allows us to assign a chunk of code to be executed at a later time when some other event takes place. And if you guys have any questions about that concept, feel free to ask. Or any questions in general, like anything I should clarify before wrapping up? Let me check the chat as well. Calgary, you guys are all good over there? Okay, I think we're good. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up. Thanks, guys.